webinar. It's my privilege to welcome Professor Richard Pettigrew from the University of Bristol, giving a talk entitled What is Epistemic Normativity and Why?
Right, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. So yeah, this is a talk about, I've kind of retitled, if you like, on the handout, the grounds of epistemic normativity. It's really a talk about a particular attempt to provide grounds for epistemic normativity. So, well, roughly what is epistemic normativity? I mean, that's going to be sort of part of the question in some ways, but we tend to think there's some sense in which there are kind of norms governing our beliefs that are in some sense distinctively epistemic norms. So you could have norms governing your beliefs that are not epistemic. It might seem an odd thing to do, but suppose someone kind of, some mind-reading despot comes and says, if you can only believe that the earth is flat, then I'll save your family from sort of terrible harm. But if you continue thinking that it's round, then they will come to terrible harm. There's some sense of normativity in which you ought to, if you possibly can, come to believe that Earth's flat in order to save your family. Okay, it's a false belief, but your family is presumably more important than that false belief, or having a true belief about that. And so there's some sort of sense of normativity in which you should, in that case, believe a falsehood. But there's also some sense, we would think, if you did that, there was some sense in which you're not doing what you ought to do, epistemically speaking. Some sort of sense of epistemic, or some sense of kind of ought, or some purely epistemic sense of ought. You're not doing what you ought to do. So that's the kind of notion of epistemic normativity that we're kind of trying to get at, though that's kind of vaguely spelt out, because part of the topic of the paper is to try to think about what epistemic normativity is. I'm going to be looking at this. I mean, there's lots of ways to approach the question I'm going to raise here, but I'm going to look at it through the lens of this particular attempt to provide a kind of ground for epistemic normativity that I've thought a lot about over the last kind of 15 years or so, which sometimes gets called epistemic utility theory, but sometimes gets called other things. Accuracy first epistemology is one thing. Epistemic decision theory, I think, is what Hilary Graves calls it. Cognitive decision theory, other people have called it. We'll see what it means in a second. So this is a particular account of what grounds these facts of epistemic normativity, grounds facts about what you ought to believe, epistemically speaking. I'll only be talking actually about what you ought to believe, epistemically speaking. You might well think there are also epistemic norms about other things like inquiring. So Carol Flores and Elise Woodard have this paper kind of asking whether there can also be these epistemic norms for inquiry, which are not believing acts, but kind of acts of going and gathering evidence. But leave that aside. It's epistemic norms governing kind of states that I'm interested in, doxastic states, beliefs. In fact, this epistemic utility theory has largely been couched in terms of credences or partial beliefs or degrees of belief, but nothing that I'm going to say today is really going to kind of turn on that. I'm not going to be doing any of the kind of formal stuff that this theory has been built on. I'm just going to be kind of, you can just substitute in kind of belief every time I talk about credences. So just to give a kind of very quick whistle-stop tour of what this theory has kind of tried to do over the last 15 years. I'll just talk about some of the norms that it's tried to give arguments in favor of, epistemic norms it's tried to give arguments in favor of. And this is to kind of, hopefully, build up the sense that this is a theory worth saving if we can. Because the whole talk is going to be, there's this major problem for it. Can we find a solution? And there's not really a great deal of point in finding a solution if the theory is not particularly appealing to begin with. So I'm going to start off trying to kind of persuade you that, that it's an appealing theory. And I mean, one of the ways I've tried to argue it's an appealing theory is a kind of by its fruits shall you know it sort of argument. Look, it can get us all these things that we kind of want in this unified and plausible way. Surely that's really appealing. So what can it give us? So, I mean, I'm just going to list off some names of norms here. People may not come across them. Some are sort of more familiar. Some of them are less familiar. Maybe to some extent, if they're not familiar, take my word that they're kind of central norms in the project of kind of uncertain belief. Yeah. So probabilism, perhaps one of the better known ones, just means that your degrees of belief should obey probability axioms. They should be probabilities, essentially. And that's all. There's a whole kind of set of rules there about how, your belief in one thing should relate to your belief in some logically related thing. And then the principle, I'm going to say introduced by David Lewis, although people will argue about precedent there. It's something that tells you how your beliefs in certain propositions should relate to your beliefs in the chances of those propositions. So if I believe a coin's fair, I should surely be 50% confident it will land heads. So because of some knowledge I have about its chance, I should have certain degrees of belief about how it will land on the next toss. Another kind of major principle. There's other ones I'm going to list there that I've listed there. These are all norms that govern kind of how your beliefs should be at any particular time, sometimes called synchronic norms for that reason. But there's also diachronic norms that tell you how your beliefs should change across time, particularly as you gather new evidence, or you don't even have to have gathered it, just hit you in the face. As new evidence comes in, you should change your beliefs in particular ways. So the particular one called conditionalization, that is kind of central to this picture. And then there are some other ones as well. I mean, together, probabilism, principle, and conditionalization is sort of ground just about all the use of probabilities that we get in the natural sciences. So if you can get those, then you're pretty close on. If you ever do any kind of reasoning in epidemiology or something like that, you've nearly, almost for sure, you'll have used probably just those three principles. So we can get grounds for those, and we've grounded a lot of scientific epistemology. But there are other sorts of things when you look beyond scientific epistemology, like norms that govern how your beliefs should change when your awareness grows, where that means where you become aware of new possibilities you hadn't considered before, where you become able to formulate new propositions you haven't entertained before because you get new conceptual resources or something like that. So there are those, and then there are, as I said, these kind of norms that govern when and how we should gather evidence and undertake certain sorts of reasoning. Again, you can use this framework to provide norms like that. So that people are aware, analytic epistemology in the last kind of 15 years has undertaken what's sometimes called the zetetic turn, which essentially, it started, in some ways began by Jane Friedman's work, which sort of reconfigures attention away from norms that govern kind of static beliefs or even the change of beliefs and over to how we should gather evidence that we get. So this theory can also give those norms. And it can also give explications of certain sorts of evaluative concepts, such as justification. Okay, so the point is it can do a lot. How does it do this? Well, it's kind of go backwards and forwards about exactly what to call it. It's either you might call a teleological account of the grounds of epistemic normativity, or an axiological account of the grounds of normativity, or perhaps kind of just less pretentiously, a kind of value-driven account of epistemic normativity. It essentially says the different kind of epistemic states, doxastic states, beliefs, credences, whatever, they have different value. They can have different epistemic value, purely epistemic value. One natural thing to say is, a true belief is more valuable than a false belief, or a true belief is more valuable than a suspension of belief, and that's itself more valuable than a false belief. Or if you work in the credences, degrees of belief framework, a higher credence in a truth is more valuable, a lower credence in a falsehood is more valuable. Okay? So the idea is that doxastic states kind of have, depending on the world you're in, have different epistemic value. And then the way that epistemic utility theory kind of proceeds, as maybe the name suggests, is that you show that if you were to violate these norms that we're trying to justify, probabilism, principle, conditionalization, and so on, if you were to violate those norms, then in some way you'd be doing predictably suboptimally at getting epistemic value. Okay. Good. Okay. So that's epistemic. So I'll illustrate it by giving what's definitely its kind of star argument, which is also the first argument that was given. And well, yeah, I think that's I can argue about history. The first kind of argument that was given in this area, which is the argument for this norm of probabilism, given by Jim Joyce in 1999. And the argument essentially goes like this. So probabilism, I kind of mentioned it, is this norm which tells you how your credences in different propositions that are logically related to one another should relate to one another. So for instance, it says things like your credence in a proposition, its negation should add up to 1. Sorry, your credence in a proposition, your credence in its negation should add up to. And it says things like, your credence in one proposition shouldn't be any higher than your credence in the proposition that it entails, that sort. So here's how Joyce argues for it. He starts off by giving an account of epistemic value for credences, degrees of belief. And his is an accuracy-based account of epistemic value. You might call it veritist or something, kind of following Alvin Goldman's sort of terminology. A veritist account. So that is the idea that what credences are trying to do is kind of get closer to truth in some sense. You're best off, your kind of godlike being would have maximal credence in truths and minimal credence in falsehoods. And what we're trying to do is be as like the godlike being as possible. Jesse Munson calls this the big knower. The big knower has credence 1 in all the truths and credence 0 in all the falsehoods. Your aim in your epistemic life is to get as close to the big knower as you possibly can. So that's the Joyce account of epistemic value. Of course, he says more than that, kind of in quite technical terms. But he starts with this account of epistemic value, and then he has a bridge principle. And the bridge principle is what's called the dominance principle, and it says, and this is a general principle that could happen whenever you've got to choose between options. That could be between different doxastic states, but it could be between different morally evaluable actions, or it could be between different paintings that you like the look of, or whatever. The principle says you should never choose one option if there's an alternative option that's guaranteed to be better. So you should never choose this option if there's some other option which in every single state of the world is better. And that looks like it's got to be the most kind of uncontroversial principle of decision theory. That's basically the principle that says don't leave free money on the table, right? Okay, so, but if you're thinking, oh no, hold that thought. Okay, so he has these two things. He has this account of epistemic value, has this dominance principle, and then he proves a theorem. And like all of the arguments in this area have some big set piece theorem at the center of them, but the details don't matter. And the theorem shows that if you're not probabilistic, so if you don't satisfy the probability axiom, there's some alternative that does, that's guaranteed to be better than yours from the point of view of this account of epistemic value. Okay, so that's the big kind of argument. So why should I not? Why should I satisfy probabilism? Because if I don't, you can come along and give me some alternative degrees of belief I could have had instead. Alternative degrees of belief in exactly the same propositions that I have degrees of belief in. And they'd be guaranteed to be better than the ones that in fact have better all states of the world. Okay, looks like a kind of slam dunk. I mean, of course, you could kind of question the account of epistemic value, and there's lots you can say about that, but that aside, it looks like this is about as watertight an argument as you can get. The problem is the dominance principle is wrong. Okay. And this is not some new observation. It's known to be wrong from kind of the early days of decision theory, but it's pointed out to be wrong in this particular context by a kind of number of different people in different ways. So here I put Carrie Jenkins, Larry Graves, Jumper Carr, all make this point about this sort of argument, or Carr actually makes it a slightly different argument. The point is the dominance principle only holds in cases where the things you're evaluating, the options you're evaluating, don't affect the state of the world at which they're evaluating. Okay. So, yeah, the classic example of it, one problem with if you ever work in decision theory is people never move away from the two examples that were given by Savage in like 1970 or something like that. So here is the classic example of why dominance fails. Suppose I've got to decide whether to study for an exam or not. It's two states of the world. I pass the exam or I fail the exam. But let's say I find studying a real drag for this particular exam. Okay, well, if I study and I pass, in the world where I pass the exam, it would have been better if I hadn't studied. So it would have been a drag to study. So I get whatever advantage, but in the world where I fail, It would have been better if I hadn't studied, because yeah, it's a disappointment, but it would have been slightly less of a disappointment if I hadn't also had to put in the effort. So not studying dominates studying, but very clearly, at least some people, studying is going to be the right thing to do. There's nothing irrational about studying. What's the problem here? Of course, the problem is that the things you're choosing between studying or not studying affect the states of the world where you evaluate them. I mean, in a very simple sense, simple version of it, you might think that the only way you'll pass is if you study. So if you study, you'll pass for sure, and if you say you don't study, you'll fail for sure. In that case, you should be, so like given the kind of just some made up numbers at the top of the second page of the handout. In that case, what I clearly should be comparing is not the numbers in each column, you know, one to the other, but rather the bolded numbers. So I should be comparing how good it would be if I studied and passed to how good it would be if I didn't study and failed. And in that case, maybe the numbers come out that I prefer to study and pass than I do to not study and fail, in which case I should study. Okay, so, but you might think, yeah, but our degrees of our beliefs aren't really like that kind of choice. They're not actions that kind of end up shaping the world. But of course, so you can think about rather elaborate cases in which they do very clearly shape the world. But then I want to convince you that actually things are much, you don't need to be nearly so elaborate as this. Okay, so here's the kind of classic example. This is due to Carrie Jenkins. So a truth fairy approaches you. This is one of these kind of rare good jokes in a philosophy paper. The truth fairy comes up to you, and the truth fairy's ability, well, partly they can read your mind, but also they can change some part of the world that you have beliefs about. So they come up to you, and perhaps there's these two propositions over here, okay? And currently your credences with respect to those are doing fine and dandy. They're obeying probabilism really nicely. And then you've got beliefs about this huge consistent set of propositions over here. But your credences are kind of somewhere in the middle, but you're not really sure how they are. Maybe they're all 50%. But the truth fairy says, if you will make yourself just slightly irrational over here in these two propositions, I will go out and make every proposition in this big set true. So that if you also have maximal credence in not every proposition in the set, you're going to get true beliefs, perfectly accurate credences, and everything over here at the very slight cost of being inaccurate over here. Okay, so let's suppose that the truth fairies approached me and done this, but I think to myself, but hang on, I've read Jim Joyce's paper. I know that if I become non-probabilistic over here, slightly irrational over here, then there will be some alternative thing I could have done that's guaranteed to be better. Now, it's true, there is something that's guaranteed to be better. The problem is that by doing the thing over here, if I do that thing, I won't have taken this epistemic bribe that truth fairies given me, and so I won't have moved to the world where all of these propositions over here are true, and so I won't be able to get the kind of gain in accuracy or epistemic value that I could have got. So, so the point is that in these kind of cases, Joyce's argument fails. There's no particular reason. He's not given us any reason to be probabilistic in that case. If the truth fairy comes up to you, offers this, and you respond by taking what, I think it's maybe Hilary Grace that calls them epistemic bribes. If you take the epistemic bribe, then Joyce can't criticize you. Because even though it's true that there's some alternative thing that would better every state of the world, if you were to have it, then the state of the world would be different in such a way that you would in fact be upset. So dominance doesn't in fact hold, and there are only certain situations in which it looks like his argument fails. Now, I think one perhaps natural response to this is to think, well, okay, we certainly did want probabilism to be this universal norm. But you've come along and described this incredibly odd case, which we almost never encounter in our lives, and told us that in that case, the argument for it fails. Maybe you know, the kind of great gains of this epistemic utility program should tell us to just bite the bullet. The problem, I think, is, I mean, one, it would just be nice to have a theory that's fully general. But also, I don't think, although truth theories are pretty rare, it's not so rare that your beliefs can end up changing the world, affecting the world in such a way that this sort of thing could happen. So here's another kind of case in which it can happen. Suppose I'm facing two choices between two different options. And those two different options will end up, you know, making, you know, changing the chances in the world. So, and one of them will end up making things a lot more determinate than the other one will. If I choose option A, let's say, then things will be very determined. I can be almost certain what will happen. If I choose option B, on the other hand, things will be much more uncertain. You know, I want to fix really what's going to happen at all. Now, it might be, all the same, you know, decision theory teaches us that it might nonetheless be rational for me to choose that second one, because that's what, in fact, maximizes my expected utility or whatever. But from an epistemic point of view, it'd be really, really good if I could choose the first one, because then things become nice and determinate, and then I can set my credences in line with them and so on. So I can know that if I could just make myself a little bit irrational. So I suppose currently I would choose the more spread out option, the option where after choosing it, the probabilities will be pretty kind of even. That's what I would currently want to choose with the credences I currently have. But if I could just make myself a little bit irrational, just make myself not quite respond to the evidence properly, then I would choose the first option, which makes things really nice and determined. Well, in that case, for epistemic reasons at least, I should do that first one. I should do the thing that makes the world more determinate, because having done it, I will then end up with kind of more accurate credences. And that's a perfectly, you know, that sort of situation almost certainly has faced you about 20 times today. Didn't think about it like that, but that sort of thing is incredibly common. You make choices all the time that have different, that end up kind of putting different kind of distributions over the state of the world, making, you know, the chances differently. Some of them will end up making things very certain. Some of them, you know, suppose the options are I get wet or I don't get wet. By staying inside, I can make it certain that I don't get wet. By going outside, I make it a lot more, not here, it's a bit like in Bristol, but then a much more kind of uncertain. Just about all of, you know, all the time you're kind of facing these decisions, which will end up making, putting different distributions over things. You've got epistemic incentive on this view to do the thing that makes things more determinate. And so it looks like yeah, there's going to be kind of cases all the time where by making yourself kind of irrational in some way, you can change the world in a way that benefits you epistemically. So there's epistemic bribes to be taken everywhere. So I think there's kind of two problems that this ends up raising for epistemic utility theory. The first one is just a problem with the argument for probabilism. Just turns out that it was based on a principle, the dominance principle, which is false. And so and it seems that we can't replace it by some principle which is true and get the same result. Second sort of problem is the epistemic utility theory seems to suggest you should take epistemic bribes at all, and we just don't think that's right. We don't think we should go, whether it involves kind of becoming irrational in any way or not. We just don't think that it's the correct response to the truth theory coming up to us that we should take it. I actually think after you kind of work in this area for long enough, maybe your intuitions become you in fact should take these things. But let's set that aside. I'm going to come in some ways to that biting the bullet response in a second. But I presume most people share the kind of general intuition of the correct way to respond to that. The truth theory, at least from an epistemic point of view, is, or on this kind of epistemic notion of normativity that I'm talking about, is not to take the bribe. Okay, how do you respond to the problem? So I'm just going to run through, probably reasonably briefly, three three, I'm going to say existing responses. I've never actually seen the first one spelled out, but I mean, it's a natural thing to say, so I'll say it. I'll briefly run through those and then I'll move on to what I think is, I mean, yeah, what I'm toying with is the correct response. Okay, so the first response is just to say, look, you just got the account of epistemic value wrong. The general idea that epistemic normativity is grounded in facts about epistemic value is completely correct. You were just wrong in your claims about epistemic value. In particular, epistemic value isn't anything like accuracy. So it's not that you get better, epistemically speaking, the closer your credences come to the truth. Rather, this response says, what you're trying to approach with your credences is something like the rational response to evidence. So the idea is something like, look, you've got this big body of evidence sitting there, and then you might think, I don't happen to think this, but a lot of people in this area do think, there's then a unique, correct, rational response based on the evidence. So I have this big block of evidence, I have a proposition, and there's some fact out there about what the correct credence would be to have in that proposition if you had that body of evidence. And this goes way back to John Maynard Keynes had this kind of view. E.T. James had this kind of view. John Williamson and Tim Williamson kind of joined Williamson forces to both have something like this view. Okay, I mean, I think it's wrong, but you might think that's true, that there is this kind of evidential probabilities, you might call them, epistemic probabilities, logical probabilities. They get called all sorts of things. And you might think that epistemic value, your degrees of belief are more epistemically valuable the closer they approximate that. So if my evidence supports a particular proposition, like it will rain tomorrow, to degree exactly 10%, then my credences get more valuable the closer they approximate 10%. And so what happens in the, what goes wrong with the epistemic bribe case, or why this is not vulnerable to the epistemic bribe case, is that what the truth fairy tells you to do is to, in some ways, violate evidential consideration. Perhaps by becoming incoherent in some way, or perhaps by believing something that you kind of have strong evidence is true, in order to give you more truth. But you can't do that if it's not truth that you're aiming at. Okay, so that's I mean, so if that account of the axiology were correct, it would indeed solve the problem. I think the problem is that it can't be right that this is the correct account of axiology. And I think the way to see it is actually to think about this kind of zetetic turn or epistemology of inquiry turn that has been sort of happening recently in epistemology. Because we presumably would want our account of the kind of axiology, our account of epistemic value, to also tell us why we should inquire. Presumably what we're trying to do when we inquire is to increase the epistemic value of the credences that we get. And the problem is that if you take this evidentialist account of the axiology, it gives you no incentive to inquire if you already match the evidence perfectly. So let's suppose you're there at the beginning of your epistemic life. Sometimes it's called in this literature being an epistemic super baby. So at the beginning of your epistemic life, you have no evidence whatsoever. And let's suppose there's a single probability function which says exactly the credences that would be rational for you to have at that point. And you're there, and you've done it. At that point, you have maximal epistemic value. Cannot be improved upon. You match the epistemic probabilities perfectly. And now the question is, should you go out and kind of inquire and discover things about the world? The answer is, well, probably not. Certainly, there's nothing that mandates you doing it, because you're at the best. There's no kind of possibility of improvement. And it might be even that you're forbidden for doing it, because while you can't get any better, there is a possibility you get worse, a possibility you get some evidence and you don't respond to it correctly. So better to just stick there. So I think the problem with evidentialist axiology, it doesn't give any impetus to inquire. And it seems like a kind of desideratum of an epistemic theory. Okay. Second view, I'm kind of bundling two views together, which I sort of worry that both the proponents of both views would say, it claims I misunderstand both of them. But the views I'm calling epistemic Kantianism, I mean, taking the name from Kurt Silvan, who proposes this version of it. I mean, the idea roughly is to kind of take an analogy with Kant's idea that the value of humanity is a value that should be respected, but not one that necessarily should be promoted. Okay, so the kind of old idea that you should try to make existing people happy, you shouldn't try to make people come into exist in order to make them happy. So Silvan thinks this is the same thing is true of epistemic value. He thinks that it's a sort of value that should be we have an obligation to respect, but not one we have an obligation to promote. And roughly ends up thinking that respecting epistemic value ends up being something like matching your credences to the evidential probabilities, and promoting it would be taking the epistemic bribes. And then Jason Connick and Ben Levenstein have a version of this, which instead of kind of drawing on Kant, draws on this old Anscombe distinction between directions of fit. I have to read this because I always forget which way around it's meant to be. So the thought is that kind of beliefs or doxastic states have world to mind direction of fit, whereas no, that's wrong. Sorry, mind to world direction of fit, whereas acts have world to mind direction of fit. Turns out I can get it wrong even when I'm reading it. And so what they interpret this, which is not an uncommon interpretation of the idea, by saying that states are things that should be evaluated for how they reflect the world, whereas acts should be the sort of things that are evaluated for how well they change the world to conform to the desires. Sorry, yeah. And the desires that give rise to them. And so what they say is happening in the epistemic bribes case is that you're evaluating the doxastic state as something like an act, or in the way that Anscombe would think is appropriate to evaluating an act, namely for how it changes the world to improve it, or to bring it in line with your desires, your epistemic desires in this case. Whereas how you should be evaluating it is something as a state. And they give a kind of neat sort of formal account of then what that ends up meaning. Okay, I mean, this is going to be far too quick because these are both kind of subtle views. But I suppose one way of putting it is it's just not obvious why you shouldn't consider the kind of effects that doxastic states have. You might have particular arguments in the Kantian case about the value of humanity, about why it's the sort of thing that ought to be respected rather than promoted. But absent that sort of argument in this kind of case, then it's not at all clear why it's the sort of thing. I mean, no harm comes by doing it. There's nobody whose rights you end up kind of violating by doing it. You just end up kind of getting yourself more epistemic value. Seems like the sort of thing. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that should be kind of vulnerable to restricting our evaluation of it to how well it reflects things rather than how well it promotes them. Okay, so there's sort of rather quick worry about that sort of view. And then the final one I'll just mention quickly is one that I proposed a while back, which was essentially the bullet point response, which said, look, in the epistemic bribes case, yes, that's exactly what you should just take the epistemic bribe. And then, because that's so wildly against our intuition, I tried to give an error theory for our false intuition about it. The error theory went something like this. It said, look, when you look at, I mean, this is essentially a kind of, the sort of version I'm kind of arguing for is kind of, or was kind of trying to defend. There's a sort of epistemic act consequentialism where you say your belief is correct if it's the one that would end up giving rise to the greatest sort of epistemic value for yourself. Okay, so it's a version of act consequentialism, but remember, of course, we've got this sort of general worry about consequentialist theories that they're kind of intractable. It's kind of impossible to know or have even in any way good information about what the long-term consequences of any of your actions are, similarly is going to be the case with your beliefs. In fact, you might think, no, not particularly the case with your beliefs. You can kind of see how it would happen. Well, if I were to change my belief in this way now, then that would end up making me choose in a different way slightly in the future. That would make things, more different options open to me further in the future. Different inquiries might come up open. You can kind of see how the change of beliefs might end up ramifying massively. So there ends up being huge numbers of consequences, and that is very difficult for us to foresee. So the thought was something like, it's just computationally incredibly difficult to figure out what would be the right thing to do in this situation. You might even think it's kind of impossible to put probabilities over those different possibilities for these kind of standard kind of cluelessness worries in the consequentialist literature. So it's not even the case I could just pop some probabilities over them and then do some sort of expected value calculation. You might think there are all these sorts of problems. And in any case, even if it were possible to do it, it would just be incredibly time consuming to do it. And so you should do something else instead. And then the thought is, well, if that's the case, then perhaps the reason we have the intuitions we have is that when we're making judgments about epistemic normativity, we don't appeal to the true theory, which is just apt consequentialism. Instead, we appeal to some heuristic which tracks the true theory most of the time, but sometimes gets it wrong, as in the epistemic bribes case. So the true theory says take the epistemic bribes. Our heuristics, which gives rise to our intuition, says don't do that. But we use the heuristic because it's much less computationally intense, and it gets the answer right most of the time. So what is the heuristic? Well, the heuristic is just supposed to be something like, look to see whether the belief is supported by the evidence. Why is that computationally more tractable? Well, for one thing, it's backwards looking. I have my evidence, it's there, fixed. I just have to look at it and see whether it supports the belief that I'm evaluating. And it's kind of local. I only have to kind of look within a circumscribed kind of neighborhood. I don't have to kind of look out into this sort of endless sequence of consequences. So the thought was, we use that heuristic, it most of the time matches the truth, and so that's how we've kind of internalized it as an intuition, and that's the error theory. That's why we get these cases wrong. I was going to say I don't think that theory is wrong. I do actually now think that theory is just wrong, for the reasons that I was kind of sketching at the beginning. I think when I proposed that, I was thinking epistemic bribes really were the only thing you had to worry about. And because they're so rare, what odds? Doesn't really matter. If they're so rare, then it is just going to be the case that this heuristic, in fact, tracks the right answer most of the time. But now I kind of, thought about it more and see that there are actually kind of epistemic bribes facing us all the time, not in the form of truth theories, but in the form of these cases where what decision I make ends up determining how determinate the world is, and therefore which is most amenable to my epistemic states. Because of how vast it is, it's going to turn out this heuristic actually just gets it wrong all the time, or at least we've no reason to think that it gets it right. So okay, I'll throw that out. I don't think that's right. So let me finish by saying what I think the correct theory is. So this is kind of draws on a general approach that a number of people have been kind of pursuing, I think, over the last, well, actually, it ends up being quite a long time. It probably goes back much further as these things invariably do. But the cases I have, the earliest one I have here is Edward Craig's approach to knowledge. But actually, that's a slightly different kind of case. But the idea here is that you could end up justifying an epistemic norm, or indeed grounding an epistemic norm, governs stochastic states, by showing that a community's adherence to that norm maximizes collective epistemic value. So I'll go into more detail about all the bits and pieces of this, but roughly speaking, I think this is something like, hopefully not vulnerable to all the problems of rule consequentialism in ethics. But it's a form of rule consequentialism where the epistemic norms are those such that are, if they were internalized and adhered, I mean, I'll talk more about what adherence means, but they're internalized widely within the community, adhered to widely within the community, and it was known that they were adhered to and internalized widely within the community, would end up giving rise to the best epistemic outcomes for the community. So a very neat version of this is due to Igor Duvin and Sylvia Wenmakers. So they have this account of, so what they want to argue is that Bayesian conditionalization, the Bayesian's way of updating, which I should say is the way that all of science proceeds, the Bayesian way of updating is the wrong one. They want to argue instead this alternative to it, which they call inference to the best explanation, but it's a little unclear whether it's quite inference to the best explanation. In any case, it's an alternative to conditionalization. They want to argue that that's the correct norm. But we're not going to get into the argument about why they think that. What I'm interested in is the way they argue for it. What they do is they set up a computer simulation of a large community of people, each of whom is kind of taking in private evidence and then updating their beliefs on the basis of that evidence, and then sharing their beliefs with one another. And then everyone in the community is kind of taking on those beliefs themselves and updating their beliefs on the basis of this testimony as well. So you've got a kind of number of steps. You've got kind of each individual takes in private evidence, they update, they share, they all update on the shared thing, then they go back a second time to get more private evidence, and so on, because the computer simulation you run this thousands of times. And they show, I think it works, but their results show that using this alternative rule ends up getting better epistemic outcomes for the community than using conditionalization. People are interested in why I think that goes wrong. It's a kind of whole story there. But that's the style of argument I'm interested in, whether or not you think that particular version works. Okay. So why would it end up being correct that not taking epistemic bribes, roughly speaking, just keeping our beliefs in line with the evidence rather than trying to change them in order to kind of make better epistemic outcomes for us, why would that end up doing better for us as an epistemic community? And that's what I want to try to talk about here. So one thing that's peculiar about, actually not so much the Duvin and Wenmakers approach, but the approaches in that are kind of under number Roman 2 in the on page 3. So particularly Sinan Doramachi and Sophie Horowitz's approach and Edward Craig's approach. So Doramachi and Horowitz are trying to argue for a particular norm, which gets called the uniqueness thesis, which roughly says that for every body of evidence, there's a unique rational epistemic response to it. Okay. And they want to argue that that norm is correct. You actually have to pick out, of course, a particular, correct probability. They want to argue that that's best because it turns out that if all of us end up having the same priors, as the Bayesian would say, roughly responds to the same evidence in exactly the same way, that will be better for us because it means that we can learn from each other more easily. So if Sarah says to me, oh, I'm 60% sure it's going to rain tomorrow, then according to them, well, I can just take that belief on as my own, because in this world where we assume that Sarah has exactly the same epistemic standards and fire that I have. That's their argument. So it eases transmission of information by testimony. The problem with that view is that's just not the way that I should respond to Sarah's saying. I mean, actually, in this sort of situation, if we're talking about Hong Kong weather, I probably should. Sarah knows more about Hong Kong weather than I do, kind of strictly more. And then, so in fact, I probably should take it on. But if it's about some fact that we both have some information about, like say the Bristol weather or something, but our information is not overlapping, I shouldn't just take on Sarah's view as my own. I should take that on, try to figure out something about what evidence would have given rise to it, add that evidence to my evidence, and then update on that. So I think the kind of Doramachi and Horowitz view doesn't work, but it's kind of instructive the way it doesn't work. And the reason that it's instructive is that it tells us one of the things that's important about testimony. Quite often in the testimony literature and epistemology, there's this kind of assumption that the way we should respond to testimony is just by taking the view on as our own. So if you tell me a particular proposition, then I should just believe that proposition. Now, there are ways that you can kind of write the norms for testimony in such that that is the right thing to do. Because if you say that you should only ever assert something because you know it, then that means that thing is true. And then, of course, if you assert it, then it's true, and then I should end up believing it. But in fact, that's not how people assert things. And it doesn't make any sense of assertions that are that sort of reveal doxastic states that are not full beliefs. So if you say something like, oh, I'm 80% sure it's going to rain tomorrow, or I'm 40% sure there's going to be thunder tonight, then yeah, you're not just kind of asserting a particular proposition that I can kind of assume is true because you would only have asserted it if you know it, and therefore it's true, and therefore I can kind of take it on as my own. You're just telling me something about your doxastic state. So what instead we should do when you learn someone's doxastic state by them telling you it or revealing it to you in some other way, is you should try to infer something about the evidence that they have. Now, one thing you might do is you try and infer something about the evidence you have, you then take that on as your evidence, combine it with your evidence and add it. So, if I think, oh, well, that means that Sarah must have read the Met Office forecast about what it's going to be like in Bristol today. And I ended up reading the BBC forecast. So I'm going to then kind of try and combine those two bits of evidence together and come up with a new credence. Then, yeah, so then that's one thing that I should kind of end up doing for this. But it also turns out, I think this kind of key thing that's missed by a lot of these views, that when I learn someone else's evidence, I learn something about where they've been, what sort of evidence they received while they were there, what they attended to while they were there, and what stuck in their mind and they remembered. So I learn a whole lot more about the person and their evidence than just what their doxastic state is. So for instance, I have a colleague, Rebecca, and two other colleagues, Lena and Javi. So suppose I know that Rebecca every morning either goes to Javi's office or to Lena's office. And I say to Rebecca tomorrow, oh, is Javi in her office? And she says, oh, I'm about 70% sure. Then I can be pretty confident she hasn't gone to Javi's office, because if she were to, then she'd either be 100% sure or 0% sure. She'd know one way or the other. So if she says, oh, 70%, I can be sure she didn't go there. So that's information that's useful to me. It's partly useful to me because now I know that she went to Lena's office. And so I know that in the future, if I want to find out, say, whether Lena still got the book that I loaned her sitting on her desk, then I can ask Rebecca about it, which I know she's been to that office. So the idea, this is a central idea in Edward Craig's view, that we have these senses and we go around the world trying to kind of gather evidence using them. But of course, we're surrounded by other people and creatures who have senses as well, who are also picking up information. And it would be unbelievably useful to us if we were able to tap those people for the information that they have. And one way you can do this is by learning what kind of doxastic states they are in as a result of having those, whatever experiences they had. So when I learn something about your doxastic state, I end up learning something about the evidence that you have. Now, that only really works if you end up forming your doxastic state on the basis of the evidence in a particular way that allows me to do some back engineering of it. If it turns out you're the sort of person who every time they might change their beliefs very slightly in order to try to kind of create greater epistemic value over here, then you're kind of a disaster to me when it comes to learning what sort of evidence you have. Because now I'm kind of hearing your credence and wondering, oh, hang on, that could be because they've got this evidence and I can then learn this other thing from them in the future. But it could be because they've kind of just taken this epistemic bribe that I have no conception of, that, that would open up this other kind of accuracy. So the idea is, so just maybe final thing to say, I won't go into the, are we doing three? Is it 3 plus 1 number now? 3 plus 7? Yeah. Okay, so I'll just wrap up just by quickly just this is a little bit like the kind of rule consequentialists justification of institutions of promising, for instance. Why is it that once you've made a promise to someone, you should fulfill that promise? Well, it's because having the institution of promising allows us to get certain sorts of value that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. In order to kind of know that you will end up doing this thing you promised to do, and so that I don't have to worry about it, allows me to say, write the paper that I wanted to write on, or what have you. And so the idea is that having a norm of promising, so a society that has a norm of promising that's widely adhered to, and it's known that it's widely adhered to, ends up being a society that ends up creating more value or generating more overall value for individuals, and well, for everybody in the community, than one in which promises are not kept. So it's meant that's the kind of standard sort of justification that is supposed to be able to be given by the rule consequentialist, the act consequentialism can't give. And the same thing is supposed to be the case here. Only by having a general norm that people respond to their evidence in the rational way can I be able to kind of rely on what I learn about your doxastic states in order to find out other facts about what evidence you have, what you attended to, what's salient to you, and so what sticks in your memory, in such a way that I can then learn further things from you in the future and generate all this extra epistemic value. Okay, understood. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have some questions for the rule consequentialist and the motivation of epistemic norm. So, first of all, I'm wondering, I think that you are concerned about, we can say that you're concerned about the holistic or diachronic consequence or the expected utility of of this epistemic state, epistemic activity.
Yeah.
But then it seems that what's wrong is not the epistemic utility theory itself. It is that we should develop a like holistic or diachronic epistemic utility. For example, you mentioned that there is epistemic pride. So if consider a case that if the epistemic pride, there is a very chaos word, and like all words is somewhat chaos, and the rule is not always be obeyed. So in this case, consider if there's some cases that we can guarantee that epistemic drive is always cause the best result. It always maximize expected utility, like throughout the time or collectively. In this case, I think your rule consequences may say that this is also a permissible case or rational case. And also you mentioned that the causal theory, like the independent of the state, right? So I'm thinking about if we like revise epistemic utility theory with not a simple like probability, but add some like imaging operators or something that also satisfy probability, then the two problems for epistemic utility you propose here may be solved in some way, and we do not have to like incur or introduce a rule consequentialism in this sense. And second question is about the social approach to epistemic norm. That I think you suggest that you agree with the social approach to epistemic norm, that we need the epistemic norm and the evaluation because of we want to maximize collective epistemic value. But I think there is also an intuition individual itself is rational, and the norm that is also can be a motivation for our develop the epistemic norm. But there is an independent theory in social epistemology that says the what is good for individual can be bad for society, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, I would think that there is a conflict between what is the collectively or socially epistemically rational or individually epistemic rational in that sense. I'd like to know what you think about.
Yeah, okay, great. So the first question I take it is the thought that there could be kind of epistemic bribes whose consequences are kind of so epistemically good that they dwarf the benefits had by having this institution around. So it's a little bit like, look, if by breaking a promise I could end up getting everyone all the happiness in the world, then yeah, of course I should break the promise, because whatever value the institution of promising gets me, it's not as big as that. I think that's right. And I think in this kind of case, this kind of view will have to bite the bullet. I think as in the case of promising, that looks kind of plausible. If I say that, look, by, I'm just kind of, could be a little bit non-probabilistic over here, I get everybody kind of, true beliefs about everything that they care to have beliefs about, then it does seem sort of plausible that in that sense I should. Now, you could say, well, yeah, but we also have this sort of feeling that there's something not exactly right about it. I think something like that happens in the promising case as well. But I think in any case, I think the answer I would like to give is this theory is also going to have to bite some bullets. So it's also going to have to accept some things that might end up not looking exactly in line with our intuitive judgments about epistemic normativity. I think that's fine, because I think all the alternatives also have some sort of problems, and if it ends up being that there are some bullets to bite, then that's fine. I think the key thing is that it cuts down the sort of number of bullets to be bitten on the kind of act consequentialist theory, and then you kind of weigh that alongside the kind of value of the theory being able to give us kind of perspicuous arguments for all of these epistemic norms and being kind of plausible to begin with. So that's what I said about the first one. The second one, I think this is a real worry. So this is a bit actually didn't get to, but because I think one version of the thing you're talking about is that is kind of known from these parts of social epistemology, that societies in which everyone does a particular thing, say is rational, end up worse than societies in which some percentage are kind of irrational in some ways. So you get this kind of in social epistemology of science. It turns out actually it's not good if everyone just kind of does the experiment that has kind of highest expected information gain, because then everyone roughly kind of pursues the same set, and you lose out if it turns out that that's actually in the wrong direction. So I think that you can build some of that sort of thing into this theory. So I think the version, I mean, it's not really a rule consequentialism, but the version I like of it is comes out of this paper by Susan Wolf about 10 years ago, where what she thinks you're evaluating are not rules, but what she calls practices. And in practices, you get rules, there includes rules, but for every rule, there are also excuses and there are sanctions. So we might have a rule like, believe an expert. When an expert on a particular topic tells you something's true and you don't really know anything about that topic, believe that. That might be your kind of rule. That might be kind of universal in that sense. Luke's kind of exceptions. But there are also kind of excuses for breaking it. There might be certain situations in which you're excused for not doing that. And then moreover, there might also be kind of sanctions for breaking it without an excuse. Kind of, people don't listen to you anymore, they don't give your views credibility, all sorts of kind of social epistemic sanctions. And roughly, I think what this allows you to do is kind of have a set of rules, but create a way of evaluating them, or evaluating the practice that they're part of, that doesn't require you to think that they're going to be adhered to 100%. because some people are just going to have natural inclinations not to obey these rules. And depending on how you set the sanctions, you can kind of set how many people in the society will end up violating the rules. And something like this essentially, I think, happens in science. We do in fact have norms, like, if a theory is kind of repeatedly refuted in a respectable journal, don't pursue experiments that try to prove that theory correct. And there are sanctions for that. People who keep on doing it don't get invited to conferences, they don't get promoted and all that sort of thing. But of course, there are going to be some people who are so strongly renegades, they'll end up doing it all the same. And there are famous cases where that's been a good thing, like the example of the kind of causes of stomach ulcers is the famous case where someone just doggedly went against scientific consensus and turned out they were correct about it. So yeah, the thought is that, yeah, if you can evaluate practices rather than kind of rules, you can end up showing why it's actually better to have people who are doing that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, different, I think, if you have these cases, they have to think more carefully about these cases where you kind of don't want anybody to be doing the individually rational thing. That's the thing that gets it best for the collective rationality. But I think those cases are less compelling.
So do you think that it is the individual level can be excused if they are doing irrational for the collective good, or both can be excused for each other if they are real?
I think there's a sense in which you can be excused. I mean, I was thinking this is a kind of attempt to kind of say what grounds an epistemic norm, and the ground is supposed to be that it's a rule within a practice that ends up having these kind of best consequences. There's a kind of separate kind of question outside that whether particular violations of these are in some sense excusable and that sort of thing. But this is supposed to just be a kind of giving a reason why, a ground for the norm of probability.
Thanks. So I think the question is just going to be inviting you to say a little bit more about rule worship. But I was just thinking about the following sort of situation. I know that there's a rule that's widely adhered to, but or sufficiently widely that it counts as being in place as part of the practice, but it only just reaches that threshold. And for whatever reason, maybe due to the whims of a weird philosophy god, if everybody follows the rule, then it's great. If most people don't, it's just okay. But if we only barely do it, then it's horrible for some reason. So it seems like there's a huge epistemic risk. Everybody's beliefs are going to get scrambled if we just barely reach that threshold. So it seems like we should just settle for second best. So I think if I was understanding the response to the previous question, you'd say should bite the bullet and accept that that's the cost of getting all this other good stuff. So my understanding.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've not got a settled view on the right response to the rule worship worry. I mean, on the handout, I kind of listed three potential ones. I mean, one I think is I'm sort of disinclined to go for, but perhaps it's right. It's just to think this is another error theory. So this is really, an explanation for why, in fact, we have the kind of intuitions that we have, because it in fact turns out that in the world that we in fact inhabit, these are the ones that were internalized by everyone, are going to be the ones that end up maximizing it. I think that's kind of one response. And so then in the kind of world that you're describing, it would just in fact be, there'd be different ones that would have internalized. But that doesn't tell us anything kind of about what epistemic normativity is, because these are ultimately just kind of, heuristics that are used, that we appeal to give an error theory for it. So they're not actually telling us what, so maybe I still just think epistemic act consequentialism is correct, but here's a kind of what I now think of as a more improved error theory. And so, but I think, in some ways, I think that's, I'm not so inclined to go down this route. I think something I'm more inclined to do is either say that, look, this is just the correct account of what epistemic ought means, but that's going to mean that it's contingent what you epistemically ought to do. So in the world that you're describing, in fact, turns out that doing whatever the thing is that that ends up doing it just is the kind of the right thing for you to do. I mean, it's a little bit complicated because if you're I mean, the way that this is supposed to avoid rule worship. So I think, in fact, something like this is what Susan Wolf thinks in that particular paper. She just thinks that that is, in fact, the correct account of what we mean by moral norms in those cases. They are, in fact, just the rules that belong to those practices, such that if they were widely adhered to, then they end up giving rise to the greatest common good. You might think that's sort of a little bit weird because it doesn't seem at all like that's what we mean. I mean, you can get your way in, you kind of get your way into thinking it by people saying things like, oh, well, all that morality is for us to kind of live kind of the best kind of lives together, given our clashing preferences. But I think when asked, that's not in fact what people mean. But I think you could go that kind of route in the epistemic case. I think it might be more plausible in the epistemic case. In the epistemic case, I think is kind of complicated. Because if you ask people, in fact, what they think they're meaning by something like the epistemic ought, they will sort of advert to some notion of kind of supported by the evidence. But if you then try to press them on what on earth that could mean, and why you might think that there's some kind of unique strength of support that a particular body of evidence gives to a particular proposition, they'll kind of founder a bit. And if you try to point out to them that the kind of last 100 years of attempting to find that sort of account have failed in quite kind of illuminating ways, it's not at all clear really that we have a kind of real meaning there. So I think you could kind of say, well, this is something like the kind of best nearby meaning that we have. But the other one, which actually kind of relates to Human's second question, is that you could say, look, there are just two senses of epistemic ought out there. There's and they relate to the two different ways that you kind of evaluate. You can evaluate a kind of act as it is part of a practice within a community, and as it's just kind of performed by the individual. And I mean, in the theory of rationality, that's not so unusual to do. If you think about how people sometimes respond to the Newcomb problem, which is meant to kind of raise what your intuitive response to it is. But some people think raise this big problem for causal decision theory. Some causal decision theorists want to say, well, really what's going on in these cases where some people are one boxers and some people are two boxers is that they're evaluating things at different, they're looking at different loci of evaluation. So you could either look at the act of choosing one box and a two box, or you could look at the kind of decision process. And if you take the causal decision theory's approach to evaluating the decision process, then yes, you should be a one boxer. If you take it to the act, then you should be a two boxer. And so really both of these are in some sense what you ought to do, but they're in different senses. So I think you could take something like that sort of approach. And I think we sort of avoid some of the kind of rule worship worries, because there would still be this sense that, yes, it is correct that you should do the thing and not worship the rule in one sense, kind of individually evaluate it. But there is this other sense, and that might be, and it might be that these two senses are kind of getting mixed up. That's when we're doing these evaluations.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's possible that you've addressed my question on the handout, but I'll ask it anyway because I think that in the talk itself. So if I understand correctly, the reason why it would be good to adhere to these norms is that they contribute, if everyone follows them, it contributes to collective epistemic value. And at least if we all know that others are following, but there's also kind of common knowledge that people are following these routes. And the reason why it would contribute to it is because you will be able to figure out, knowing that others are following these rules, what kind of evidence have been exposed to something like this in their possession. But I mean, it seems that the last thing about the mechanism why it's contributed to collective epistemic, what's the exact term?
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah.
Collective epistemic, good. Like that. Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Mechanism. So wouldn't you have a different mechanism?
Yeah.
Leads to the same outcome where, say, some people that we know, we can recognize, follow inverse probabilism. So where if probabilism says your equilibrium says to be C, trying to their inverse probabilism, it's my 1 minus or something like this, something more complicated. So you could actually arrive at the same result, but these people would be widely irrational, at least according to probabilism.
That's right. So, the reason I think that doesn't end up happening, why it's these norms, is that in this kind of ecology in which people are kind of forming beliefs and revealing them or testifying to having them or guiding their behavior by them, the beliefs themselves kind of play two roles in them. One is just they're the things being evaluated, they're the things that contribute to the overall epistemic good. When you kind of look down as the kind of epistemic exam marker, and you're kind of looking at the community and seeing how they do, then you look at the individual's beliefs, how well they match the world, and you kind of add all that up. But they're also doing this thing of being the states that guide you into testifying in a particular way. And so the original arguments that we have are what tell us that, look, so the argument I've just tried to give is supposed to tell us that there should be some sort of mechanism that allows us to kind of make inferences backwards. The reasons they should be these ones is because these are the ones we know have these kind of epistemic arguments in their favor. So if you're going to have ones that are not kind of chosen in order to kind of make decisions in the world, then you should really choose the ones that satisfy probabilism, because if you didn't, then you could have chosen some alternative ones. You could have had this alternative set of mechanism, and we kind of have these reasons to think that those alternative ones are better.
So what if we exclude those inverse probabilist people from our community? So we say when we do the mark and we calculate the collective epistemic group, we don't take their beliefs into account.
Then you would certainly get something. Then you would, be, they would be just as good as kind of contributors. If you kind of had this, kind of dual workforce, if you like, this kind of group who are kind of there to kind of aid us and aid the kind of the other group in forming their beliefs, but their beliefs don't end up getting greater. Then absolutely right. You would guess it. So it has to be that the whole community is kind of both doing the transmitting and so on, and also being the ones marking. I think in order to get this kind of result, I think otherwise you're absolutely right. This argument really is just an argument that I should be able to back engineer some ways the evidence that you have. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Other
So this is a question about the evidentialist response. So the concern with the evidential response was if it's correct that it's never mandated on epistemic grounds that a perfectly rational person should inquire. Right. So I'm not sure why that's such a problem, provided because you still might have rational grounds to inquire, even if you don't have epistemic grounds. So, for example, you might be in a situation where it's 50% likely that A is the murderer and 50% likely that B is the murderer. And it's really important to find out who the murderer is for various reasons. So therefore, you do inquiry, and after inquiry, it ends up being 98% chance that it's A that's the murderer, and then you take action. So I wasn't moved by that. I wasn't moved by that objection.
So absolutely right. So you can get kind of pragmatic reasons for inquiry, and most of our inquiry is in fact driven by that. But there's a kind of core of inquiry that's driven on kind of purely epistemic grounds inquiries that we don't think are going to end up kind of having practical kind of consequences for us, things that we're interested in. You have an interest in history of war or that political period or something. You might think that it'll come up at the pub quiz and it might earn you money if you get it right, but almost certainly you're kind of doing the investigation for epistemic reasons. Now you might think, yeah, okay, but those kind of inquiries, you don't want them to be mandated or something like that. The worry about this is that, for the evidentialist, it might even be the case that they're, the reason they're forbidden, because really, so it depends, inquiring for the person who, currently has perfect, nucleus perfectly matched that things kind of has two possibilities. It might keep them at the same level or it might make them worse. Now, some decision theories will tell you that in those cases, you ought not to do the thing. If something could never gain you anything, it could only lose something, you should do it. Other decision theories don't think that that's kind of a principle, but it seems reasonably plausible in this kind of case because you're going to have some, reason to think it's at least, have some probability that it will end up kind of leading you down the wrong way. And so it would in fact be the kind of wrong thing to do from the point of view of kind of expected epistemic utility so if I'm there and I currently know nothing about like the causes of French Revolution or something like that, and I know I can kind of look up Wikipedia and kind of gain lots of information about it, and that really interests me, but I basically think it will never guide my action in any way, then this theory would just tell you that's irrational for you to do it. So now I'm not going to give you any pragmatic benefit. It may give you neither, benefit nor detriment on the epistemic side, but it could give you detriment. And so, and so it would be in fact irrational for you to do.
I'm not sure why it's irrational, but you might want to learn about those things, and so you gain the benefit. Maybe it's like you desire to learn it, and then you satisfy your desires. So it is rational. I think it's very similar to the detective case.
But that sort of is the epistemic value of it. I mean, I'm not. So I mean, maybe I wasn't.
So it's not. It's just like the value is like you want to find out about something.
Right.
That's the value, and then the epistemic stuff's all about giving the evidence.
But that suggests that then you do have epistemic, you do value truth about, you do have an epistemic value that's not evidentialist. You have a value that attaches to having particular doxastic states that goes beyond, or is in fact in conflict with just matching the evidence. So by desire to kind of have true beliefs about this thing, that just is having non-evidentialist epistemic value, right? I mean,
I suppose you desire to have 9.7% credence, or maybe.
Oh yeah, so sure. I mean, you can get this. I mean, you can get this to work if. You could. It's not just the veritas that will kind of get you out of the evidentialist thing. You could have some slightly wacky thing like, I want to have exactly 97% credence and truths. That will also kind of give kind of weird consequences, like someone who's 99% confident should kind of go out seeking counter evidence.
So the main thing we'll talk about, like I desire to have a justified belief, that such and such. So above certain percent of like probability and justified, that's the desire.
Right. That would again be different. That would be against the evidentialist axiology. That would be having a different. Because you're wanting to have a belief. You're meaning, if you want to have a justified belief, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, sorry. So then that isn't. So and currently you're kind of suspending. So it gives you some impetus to inquire. Is that right? So there's going to be other cases then where that would give you the kind of wrong incentives, right? Suppose I currently have a justified belief, but I know that by inquiring I could improve the justification for it, or I could kind of get closer to the truth. Suppose to have a justified belief, I just need to have justified credence of 85%. And I'm sitting there, there's this further inquiry that I could do. Then it's going to tell you that you shouldn't do it because you've already got the maximal epistemic value, you've got your justified belief in it. But in those kind of cases, we think that at least should be permissible for you to go out and do it. Suppose I started now in my work on the French Revolution, and I've kind of learned that part of the causes of it were the flower riots or whatever, and but I've got justified belief in that because I've read 5 or 6 articles and they've all kind of talked about that. And now there's this further article I know I could look up, find a reputable source that tells me whether that was really the genuine cause of it or whether it's kind of not really relevant. That sort of view would then tell me it's just irrational for you to go and find that further thing out because you've already got maximal. I think the general point is that if you get anything that's kind of gives epistemic value, maximal epistemic value less than belief, there are going to be cases where, less than maximal true credence, there are going to be cases where we think that you should go out and inquire, but this will tell you, in fact, it's forbidden for you to go out and inquire because you've already. I mean, even people in the inquiry literature now who think that knowledge is the kind of end goal of all of this now think that there's cases where you can have knowledge and still think it's rational to go out and believe, basically because knowledge can be improved. You can get even safer belief or something like that. And so any of these accounts where the kind of epistemic value I have is kind of falls short of true belief, I think I'll end up doing it. But anyway, the evidentialist ones. But I also think some of these other ones that you're talking about, like justified belief, you'll actually be vulnerable to the epistemic bribes problem as well. So in some ways, that is kind of what the truth fairy does. I mean, I've been putting in terms of credences, but actually what she gives you is, you kind of mess things up over here, and she gives you a whole bunch of knowledge, justified belief, all the kind of good things that we want. But so it's not really just the kind of veritist, I think, who faces the problem. The kind of knowledgey person, the justification person is also going to face the epistemic bribes problem.
I was going to say the same thing as Dan Marshall. Is there anybody else who wants to go?
Do you want to follow Dan?
I've already said something, but you should go.
Yeah, so I have the same idea as Dan, and my concern is you want the knowledge. That doesn't mean that the knowledge has epistemic value itself. It could still be that the epistemic value is its proximity to this toxic state that's cortical evidence. It's just, you have prudential. It's the prudential value. Knowledge is prudential value. Yeah, because you get. So it could still be, it could be mandated to inquire prudentially, pragmatically, and the value would still just be as the evidential said.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of, essentially, I'm not thinking there's something that's epistemic value that's not something like prudential valuing of being in the knowledge state. So the thought is not that there's this kind of, so to some extent that's true, to some extent it's not. On these views, there's going to be a kind of, what's the right way to put this? The person who wants to have knowledge is someone who, in fact, values doxastic, gives, assigns epistemic value to doxastic states that are knowledge. That's kind of, there's not some sense in which this is meant to be some different kind of source of value. Now, you might think, but you could end up valuing whatever you like. I might end up valuing false beliefs and that sort of thing. But that is very much just like the kind of moral case for your other sort of prudential beliefs. It could end up that I really value wounding puppies or something like that. But that doesn't mean that I then have kind of reason to do that. Doesn't mean that that ends up having this kind of action guiding value. The thought is something like this, a kind of circumscribed sphere of what is kind of permissible to to value, epistemically speaking, where that just means kind of assigning value to having doxastic states. So it's not like anything goes in this. It's not kind of a Humean picture. But there is some leniency. You might find propositions about the Russian Revolution really interesting, and I find propositions about the French Revolution really interesting. And so we in fact value different things. And I mean, I don't actually think this ends up working, but you could end up being someone who really values kind of knowledge, and I only value true belief. I don't think that the extra kind of accoutrement of knowledge end up being valuable themselves. So the thought is you have this kind of collection of kind of permissible ways to value doxastic states for their purely epistemic features. And then, yeah, that's the notion of epistemic value that's supposed to be giving rise to this. So I think, yeah, this is not the person who says, look, I think the only epistemic value is in matching the evidence, but I really myself want to have states of knowledge or true beliefs or something like that. They're sort of reporting things incorrectly. That means, in fact, they don't have the evidentialist account of epistemic value. Their way of valuing epistemic states is in fact not the evidentialists. And then, of course, if you have someone like that, then yeah, they will avoid these problems. But I think they won't avoid those. They won't avoid all problems like it unless they have something like a veritas sort of account, because only really having kind of maximal credence in truths is the only real, well, this is a separate argument, but I think the only real stopping point for why. Yes.
Simon, yeah.
I did pretty much the same as James, but I just like I'm not sure I understood the response. I just want to like try to press it one more way. So I did what is being misrepresented or must be misreported if I give the following little speech? Like, I'm an evidentialist. I think that everything is I think that I'm a max epistemic value with respect to my grievances about the French Revolution. Nevertheless, I just have this burning drive to inquiry and to study the French Revolution. And I'm also a committed desire satisfactionist, so I think it's going to be extremely good for me to study the French Revolution. So I just have a conflict between values. I think that I'm going to be epistemically worse off, but prudentially much better off if I engage in inquiry. And so I just, I have to weigh those values against each other. Why, or maybe I misunderstood him, but I took you to be saying there's something incoherent about that speech, or it must be a misrepresentation of, can't really be an evidentialist if I think that way, but guess I'm not seeing what.
So I think not that speech is incoherent. So someone who just loves the process of inquiry, who just really gets a kick out of it, gives great pleasure or something like that, I think that's completely coherent, and that would of course give someone an impetus to inquire. But we would presumably want to say that for someone who doesn't get those kind of extra non-epistemic kind of goods out of inquiry, would still not be forbidden from inquiring, which is what the evidentialists would have to say. The thing that I was thinking was incoherent was the person who said, look, I have the evidentialist account of epistemic value, but I just really want to have true beliefs. That just means that their notion of epistemic value is in fact something like the veritas, or it might be some sort of hybrid notion where you think you kind of add together evidentialist notion of value and the veritas or whatever. But the point is that they can't be a kind of pure evidentialist there, because they're, it'd be like me saying something like,
want them for prudential or moral reasons.
Sorry,
if they want them for like prudential or moral reasons. I mean, suppose this person thinks God has commanded us to have true beliefs, but
yeah, okay. So that also I think would not be incoherent if their kind of reason for having them is kind of something that's not to do with it, kind of being particularly I mean, there I think it's maybe a little bit kind of icier, but in any case, I think the response in all of those cases are even for people not like that. even people who don't have these kind of pro attitudes towards true beliefs that are grounded in something other than their kind of epistemic value, or like their theistic value or something, or their moral value or something like that. Even for people like that, it should be permissible to inquire, and it won't be according to the evidentialists' accounts. So the thought I was having, you know, the thing I was trying to say was incoherent, be a little bit like me saying something like, you know, all of my credential value is determined by, you know, how much pleasure I get. But also, you know, I really value loyalty, regardless of whether it gives pleasure or something like that. You're like, no, that means that not all of your credential value is given by pleasure. It's also got this, there's this other component to it, I mean, like, kind of you value loyalty over and above its ability to give pleasure or something like that. That was meant to be the same sort of coherence I was getting at with someone saying, oh, look, I only value, my only notion of epistemic value, my notion of epistemic value is exhausted by matching the evidence. But also I really want true beliefs. But I think you're completely right. If it turns out there's kind of this other thing you want, and that kind of has a consequence, a necessary consequence, getting true beliefs, like I want to do what God likes, and God likes me having true beliefs or something like that, then that does look more like credential value. But then you'd have this worry that people without that should be permitted to inquire. People who kind of don't have these indirect pro attitudes towards true belief should be able to inquire, and they wouldn't on this.
We're out of time.
Thank you very much.